Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. And if they are depending on these products, they really need to know that what's being told to them is accurate and it's truthful and not misleading. That's the standard. So our guest for today is going to actually help us figure out, and we've actually had him on several times and we have him relatively routinely on. And the only reason I use the word relatively is because it's not every month, but it's nearly every month at this point. So it's always good to have him on. So as you know, I'm a pharmacist, I'm a lawyer, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, consider cannabis or sort of peruse pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. I should point out, and this is something we both have to do because we're both lawyers. This is not legal advice. It's not clinical advice. It's not regulatory advice. If you need any of those, call us. We'd be happy to give it to you. But right now it's educational. I do these podcasts because they're interesting, because they're educational, and it's always fun to talk to really smart people like our guest today. So if you do like what you're hearing, please leave a comment, please subscribe. More importantly, if you like what you're hearing, please share this with people. And our guest today would appreciate it if you share our talk with people, because hopefully it means that people will learn something and maybe even come to us for some work. So if you do want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or find me on my website at darshantalks.com. Said a lot of stuff about myself. Let's talk a little bit about our guest. Today's podcast is going to be about promotional compliance, and he is an expert. He is the guy you go to. He and I have presented multiple times, and he's sort of the guru on promotional compliance. Our guest for today is the president of PhillyCooke Consulting and FDA Ad Law. He's a lawyer. He's an FDA consultant. And our guest for today is Dale Cooke. Hey, Dale, how are you?
Hey, Darshan, how you doing? Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Dale, quick question for you. What did I forget? Did I forget to mention anything that I should have had in there?
No, that's good. Yeah, I mean, we've got the disclaimer. You got the who I am. That's enough. People want to learn more. They can always go to PhillyCooke.com.
There you go. You go to PhillyCooke.com. So let's take a quick jump into things that are new, things that are happening, and find out what's going on. So here's one of the things I've seen, and we very briefly touched on it right before we got on, which is the idea of creating a VR, a virtual reality world, where it becomes a space to engage. And now the question becomes, engage on what, engage with whom, all of those questions. But let's start with the beginning. Is VR a good place for pharma to engage with either patients, either with physicians, with prescribers, with other healthcare providers, or is it too much of a push because there's not enough adoption yet and the rules aren't clear?
Yeah, so I mentioned this, as you say, just briefly before we actually came on air. I've consulted on a few VR projects. None of them have actually come to fruition. They've all been, in the planning stages, developing things out, and then for whatever reason, didn't actually make it into the marketplace. So, the types of engagements that I was brought into were blurring that line between education and promotion, trying to get, for example, physicians and caregivers to get some of the experience of different conditions, the disorientation, the discomfort that can come from things, and to try to get the people to help with the empathize of what the patients are going through and what the experience of, being treated can potentially eliminate from their day-to-day life. So, in those sorts of engagements, the types of things that are challenging, if you're engaging in promotional labeling, okay, now FDA, one of the big concerns there is going to be, are you being representative of the data, right? And that can be a challenge because, you've got a range of patients with a range of conditions, a range of impacts, and a range of improvements. And so any given experience is going to be a single data point, right? And choosing a single data point that is actually somewhat representative of what is going to be experienced is going to be a bit of a challenge. Communicating your benefit there is going to be difficult, right? Also communicating your risks in that experience. If you're communicating the benefit through that sort of, improvement of experience, you have to then try to get the risks in the same sort of modality so that also becomes part of the virtual experience. How do you do that for some of these risks? What about the extremely rare ones that are, unlikely to occur but are severe, right? What are you going to do for virtual reality if one of your potential risks is death? Obviously you're going to just say something, right? You're going to communicate that, perhaps some visual, verbal, superimposed text in the experience, perhaps, through, some audio communication, ensuring that you're getting a genuinely balanced representation of benefits and risks is going to be a challenge. I mean, that certainly when we were working through those sorts of things, the natural inclination when, or at least I shouldn't say that because I don't have that much experience. The few times that I've done this, the inclination was to focus on the improvements and the benefits that were coming through the VR experience, and less attention was being paid until I was brought in to this communication of the risks and how that was going to genuinely be comparable, right? And you want it to be comparable, you want it to get, achieve your fair balance requirement, but you don't want it to overwhelm. And you certainly don't want it to leave, people with an experience that, they're sort of like, well, gee, if those are all of the risks, then what in the world, the benefits, aren't going to be worth it, right? So it's a challenge to work through those sorts of things, and just having the additional modalities of the VR experience. They were interesting challenges to consult on. I wish the project had come into the marketplace, but
no. But let's explore that a little bit, because I mean, I have about 6 questions to get into, but what I'm hearing you say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the type of project, and again, we don't want to get into project specifics, but the type of project you were involved in seems to have been more of almost a labeling type scenario where they're using it as an adjunct to a package insert. Is that fair, or is that because? And the reason I'm saying that is because you were trying to explain the risks and the benefits and the comparability of that. But if you're using it more as, say, a forum, so imagine doing a DIA or doing an ASCO or doing one of these large.
I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, no, the projects I was involved in consulting on were intended to be promotional labeling projects that were, as I say, were designed to sort of give the person experiencing the virtual reality, that person, something of the experience of the condition and the improvements that would occur through effective treatment. I think you're describing more sort of like the types of conference experiences or other engagements, more sort of, it's an avatar, that experience where, you're engaging. And I've worked on a few of those sorts of things. I don't think those are as challenging as, because it's just the engagement that you have on the floor of a convention such as ASCO or DIA or any of the ones you mentioned, but now just in the virtual world. And so you got some additional concerns. You have concerns around, recording of communications going on. It's not the type of thing I'm not aware of, the ability to truly limit those communications and prevent people from, recording or otherwise tracking that communication. And then, if the other party to it is engaging in that sort of recording, then what are they doing with it? So, you can wind up with these sorts of materials that are then out there that obviously were not intended for standalone distribution or viewing. So those sorts of concerns are always present anytime you've got, even what we're doing right now, right? I mean, I know that you are, in fact, recording this and that it's not just live, that, people can view your podcast later, I assume, from your website, Darshan Talks, right, where all of the podcasts live. But, but if assume you weren't doing that, assume this was just intended to just be our live conversation, all of your viewers could be using very basic, screen capture software. I have it on my computer. I'm sure you have it on yours, to create their own version of this, and then, edit it. And, once you are, ruling the world and making millions per day, then I'm sure people will put out the parody videos of your stuff and re-edit your podcast to make it look like you're a fool, or, completely, things that would never be true in the actual recordings, but then they've altered it in some way. And now you get into some interesting intellectual property concerns about whether it's fair use, and you get all sorts of other issues going on there. But,
it's interesting to me. What you played out for me was almost like what we see in law school, right? It's one of those, if you did this little germ of a thing, it's like this entire parade of horribles could happen. You're just kind of going, I just want to sit inside my chamber and die. It's just so much easier.
Well, I mean, it is, but, the downside, of course, is that then you'd never be able to engage in any of these activities. And these activities are enjoyable, they're educational, they're beneficial for you, for the companies that are engaging in them, right? Yeah. So, yes, it's always true that doing absolutely nothing is probably the safest route in most circumstances. I mean, there certainly are circumstances where you must proactively do things, but why would you possibly want to? How long would you stay in business if you did nothing?
But let's explore that a little bit more. So you're talking about some parade of horribles, and that's great. And we can get into some of these, but let's start with the basic one, which is if you use VR and you want to talk to patients. Is patient engagement in your book a promotional engagement, or can it be something that's done by the scientific department, i.e. the medical affairs department? Or is it necessarily promotional because it's by definition direct to consumer?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of direct to consumer scientific exchange, which I think is where you're going, is one that is challenging. By definition, you're talking to consumers, so you assume that they are not scientists, though, of course, consumers could be. They certainly can be educated about the science, and then we're not really involved in scientific exchange. We're involved in, disease awareness, condition awareness, all of those sorts of educational things. And if we're not discussing any specific product, we might even be able to do that in a way that is completely non-promotional. I can easily imagine, taking a disease awareness website that has a significant amount of scientific information about different treatment modalities and reasons why one type of therapy is different from another, and the pros and cons of those different treatments that don't discuss any specific product. Here are the different, types of medication for controlling your cholesterol, and here are the pros and the cons of these different medications. You can absolutely go down that pathway and do that. Doesn't have to be product promotion, but as I say, my experience in virtual reality was where they wanted to do it for a product.
Right. No, I guess I'm asking the question that theoretically what you're saying is you could have a direct-to-consumer scientific exchange, but by definition, like, they don't meet that requirement. Have you seen anything from OPDP or CDRH or anyone else commenting on that? Now, I'll tell you sort of what I've seen to sort of add to it. I think there's there's obviously the guidance from the off-label guidance, which talks a little bit about you have to be consistent with the label, and you can. So if you're consistent with the label, as long as you're not adding new risks, theoretically, we're going to say that that's okay. So theoretically, you're engaging.
Well, we just want to be clear that there are multiple different guidances, right? There's the CFL guidance, consistent with labeling guidance.
Yep.
And that's not an off-label guidance, right? That's not about off-label communications. That's about, information that's beyond the label about approved indications. Then you got the off-label guidances, which are about how to communicate off-label information, responding to unsolicited requests, distributing reprints, etc. And at least in theory, there's no limitation on, the audiences per se, right? In terms of your initial question, have I seen anything from the agency on this? No, not directly on point, because we're still awaiting, go back to the federal notice from the distribution of reprints, 2015, is that when that was? I think
like 17 or something. But yeah, we're in the same
updated, distribution of reprints, and that federal notice says, we're still working on this issue of, scientific exchange, and and it's like, okay, well, it's a few years now. Could we get something, please?
But here's the thing. We get both of us get two types of clients for the most part. One type of client is going, I want to stick with what I know is okay. And then there's the other type of client, which is, I want to push the envelope. And when I want to push the envelope, I want to know specifically, and this is consistent with the Supreme Court decision on Fox v. FCC, where the Supreme Court came out and said that if you don't specifically tell someone what not to do, you can't prosecute them for doing it. So in that same criteria, does it make sense for the FDA to have not promulgated guidance and therefore not be able to actually prosecute people for it? What has been your experience around that?
Well, so, you can't prosecute based on guidance, right? So guidance is not legally binding, right? Not typically legally binding unless Congress makes a guidance legally binding. They do that sometimes in the law for various reasons. But so the guidance itself would not, enable or hinder prosecutions. If there were regulations that were promulgated that then, could be enforced, in this arena, there's a dearth of, explanation about what's going on. So I'm not sure. I don't know how that specific thing would play out in this context. It's an interesting hypothetical that you're raising. I don't know how that precedent would apply.
Here's the way I see it for the most part, which is I see people, at least most of my clients for the most part, when I get advised, I tell them that this option exists. But the fact is that, do you really want to be fighting the FDA? Is that really where you want to spend your time, energy, and efforts? Wouldn't you rather just be in this? It's clear this is the direction you want to go, and if someday the FDA comes after you, you have this as your backup. But don't be starting from there. That you have very little. You're already at the edge at that point, and it's problematic, and it come back to haunt you very quickly. It's easier to stay within the metes and bounds we already know.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for most companies, this is also where you tend to see these sorts of cases brought up in the circumstance of things like a single product company, right? You've got a broader relationship with the agency than, this one tiny issue, whatever that issue is. And so, I'm not suggesting that anybody at FDA would violate the law because they didn't like something you were doing. I would never suggest that. But, I certainly would suggest that, if you're reputationally, known as somebody who is engaging in inappropriate behavior, you have to assume that reputation carries over and colors all of your interactions with the agency. It would be naive to think that somehow or other yes, you have that reputation, but no, in this specific circumstance, we can absolutely ignore that. I mean, that would be silly, right? No adults think that way, I hope.
I actually agree with you. The other thing that sort of popped in my head, and there's so many things I can get into, but I'm trying to be respectful. Have you seen a lot of work around people trying to use EHRs to impact prescribing, use that as a promotional tool? And I'll give you, well, I'll let you speak before I get into anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know what the percentages are among the commercial EHR tools, but certainly several of them permit promotional messaging, and pretty standardly seeing some form of promotional messaging, ranging from, the opportunities to enroll patients in patient support programs at the time the script is being written, prompting physicians to do that. Oh, gee, Dr. Smith, we see you're writing a script for brand X. Brand X has, this promotional, this patient support program. Would you like to enroll their patient in this? Would you, mention that to your patient, kind of thing? To potentially, did you consider, alternate therapies, that are available? And that sort of messaging, as I say, is, I think, I don't know what the percentages are on
Sure.
EHRs that permit it versus those that don't enable those sorts of communications. But yeah, that sort of messaging is out there. Mm-hmm.
Are you, again, this is one of those things that unless you're looking into the topic, you wouldn't really know. But are you familiar with the Practice Fusion settlement?
No.
Okay, so let me give you the short version. Practice Fusion was basically using an EHR to talk about, here might be a drug you want to consider. In that specific instance, it was opioids. And the DOJ was not a happy camper with that. Neither was OIG for obvious reasons. My question for you, and again, we don't know, I don't specifically know how they position the alternative drugs or whatever it was. But as you mentioned, there are EHRs that do this. Practice Fusion was targeted. My question for you is, if you were an EHR company, this is obviously a big money maker. How do you do this right? What are ways? And I'll start us off just to kind of get us going. But I think an example of, at least you're going to stay in shark infested waters, whatever you do. But I think that you get to minimize that. Maybe, I don't know what the alternative of rubbing chum off yourself is, but I think you start off by saying you don't give one drug, you give multiple drug options, and that minimizes that whole kickback / false claims argument, because you start saying, okay, we've got we're not promoting a specific drug, we're giving you alternatives. So it's not promotional in the sense that we're pushing you towards one drug and we're steering you towards one drug. But
so I think we're talking about a different scenario. I was talking about, a paid placement that is coming up that is clearly intended as a paid promotional message that, somehow clearly communicates, like on a search engine results page where you would see, paid promotional message here followed by organic search results, right?
Yeah.
And as much as FDA, it's FTC who has been like, you've got to be really clear about what are the paid promotional messages and what are the organic results. And we've seen that get communicated in different forums over the years. So that's the type of thing I was describing. I think you're discussing sort of that the results were somehow or other themselves being filtered out.
Right.
To encourage certain drugs and discourage other drugs, if I understand your scenario. And I think that's a don't do that scenario. I think that's the big takeaway there. And I mean, from an EHR perspective, the reputational damage there, I think, would be significant if physicians believe that they're not getting unfiltered results if they don't. So
that's an interesting argument, though. So what I'm hearing you saying is, the way to prevent that almost would be don't tie it to results. Do the opposite of tying it to results. So if the natural thing the physician would order is, say, an opioid, like in the practice fusion case, do everything but show an opioid. Because what you're trying to say is that we're not trying to pitch you an alternative to a product that you already have. We're trying to, and again, we're not giving legal advice, just to be clear, not giving regulatory advice. But what we're trying to say, if you're doing an opioid, maybe talk about blood pressure medication. And that, since you're not tying them to each other, it's almost like a product placement on Google, where you're basically saying, here's another drug that might be interesting if that ever becomes of issue to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so for the paid placements, I would say you would want them to be, relevant, right? And so comparable to, the search engine results when you buy certain, keyword terms in on a search engine, or not buy them, but bid on them, right? Then what you're trying to do is say, well, if the person is searching for this information, we think they're likely to be interested in this particular product that we're promoting. So for paid searches, I would say, yeah, that's sort of it. And then you've got the organic results, and you want your organic results to be pure, right? You want your organic results to be just whatever the algorithm determines are the most relevant results, and you want that algorithm not to be influenced by paid. You don't want somebody to be able to buy their way into the organic results.
I think that the consideration, as I see it, and again, feel free to correct me if you see it differently, is in the case of Google, it's not it's not tied to the specific prescribing behavior. On the other hand, when you do it in the middle of an EHR, the physician's only in there to prescribe, so you're directly influencing the EHR behavior and the prescribing behavior. I think that key distinction is important, because you can do or tie it to keywords in the case of Google, because you're not going to the specific behavior. But in the EHR, you probably would be, which is why I think it's a little bit more complicated than going, we have to tie to some kind of relevant search, because otherwise, why else would someone do it? I think you've got to stay away from that. But what's your take on it?
Yeah. I mean, EHRs have different capabilities. And so as with any placement and discussions around that, you really have to understand exactly what the capabilities are, and what the experience is, and what the physician is going to see, and potentially share, right? I mean, if you're doing something like encouraging a physician to enroll their patient in a patient support program, then you might even be thinking that the physician will at some point turn the monitor, right, and have the patient enter their information, and acknowledge that they are the ones who are doing this, and all of that, sort of what that experience is like. So you want to support that experience. You don't want to interrupt it. You don't want to meddle with that intimacy.
Interesting. We are, as usual, well past time, because Dale, you are always a fascinating person to talk to. Let's sort of wrap it up a little bit. Let's ask the three questions I try to ask. The first question: what would you like to ask the audience based on what we've discussed?
What would I like to ask the audience based on what we've discussed? Well, what their experiences are with virtual reality. Has anybody brought something to the marketplace that they, or seen something done in the marketplace that they think was particularly well done or not well done, that they would like to share or call out?
Good question. As you know, I try to answer the first question myself, just so we have something to start people off. My thought process is, I've seen people try to do the whole DIA ASCO virtual conference thing. And I think I haven't seen it done well yet. It may be that it is, and I just haven't seen it. But I think it's interesting, because you can have that one-on-one engagement. But I think on the flip side, from a regulatory perspective, I think it raises new questions. For example, usually when we look at things in 3 dimensions and sort of looking at eye level. But in VR, you can fly, you can do all those other things. Now you start to start needing to do a 360-degree view, and that's going to become more important from a compliance MLR strategy review perspective as to what message are you sending, and are you doing it right? Because my experience is that, and we've both sort of dealt with this a little bit. Sales and marketing try to push the envelope, and sometimes aren't particularly clear about all the goals they've tried to get in there. I've had a couple of different guests on here who've spoken to me about how they think that they toe that line in a way that they can get past MLR, which I think is the exact opposite of what you're trying to achieve. It's not about how do we get past or sneak past MLR. It's about how do we do it right, and MLR can help. But that would be my response. Anything to that, or?
No, I agree. If you're submitting materials for the MLR PRC review process and hoping they get through, and that nobody notices this violative thing that's going on, then you're going down a path that you just should not be going down. Period. Right.
Correct. So that'd be my first thing. Second thing, what made you happy this week?
What made me happy this week? I've got a vacation coming up, and I've been thinking about the vacation that I'm going to be taking next week. First one post-pandemic.
The big vacation. I know a lot of people talking about it. It's funny. I just saw the news yesterday or today, and they were like, "If you are planning on traveling this week, leave early." And I was like, "Yeah, that's probably good advice because everyone's going to get out of here." Everyone I talked to is like, "I'm leaving next week."
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So that should be good. What's something you learned this month?
Something that I learned this month? Goodness. What did I learn this month? I've been reading a lot of stories about about some of the recent approvals at the agency and some of the decisions at the agency, and they've been enlightening.
A topic we need to come back to, as you and I have spoken about. So yeah. I'm hoping to let it ride on a little bit, but we're going to have Dale talk to us about that. So let me do a quick summary. We landed up talking a little bit about the difference between education and promotion. We talked a little bit about how in the case of VR, people are trying to sort of balance those two goals. We talked a little bit about the VRs we were initially talking about were really about experiencing and giving the person a feel for what to expect. So what kind of disorientation they might expect and what that could look like. But the big question that comes up is, are you being representative of the data? The key piece being, how do you choose the appropriate data points to be representative? What are representative data points? Which I really think should be a guidance that the FDA should put out at some point anyways. Because you can't come back after the fact and say this is not representative, but don't tell me how to do it in the first place. It's really not very fair. You talked a little bit about how that becomes even more challenging when you're communicating the risks and benefits in VR, specifically when you're talking about the organizations, for the most part, have been trying to talk a lot about the benefits, but they haven't been doing as much of the risk until you, for example, came in and went, wait a second, this isn't completely kosher.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate it. don't want to make it sound too much like I was the hero coming in there. It was, it hadn't been fully appreciated. That also has to be part of the experience. Yeah.
I think that you was the hero. There's nothing wrong with that. So that's good. Then there were obviously we talked a little bit more about how do you do that with rare disease states that might still be severe. So important risks, if you will. And then we talked about other risks that might pop up. For example, what if these communications get recorded? So that might be another angle. We then went down the whole angle of EHRs. We talked a little bit about EHRs and the risks associated with emotion on EHRs. It could be everything from a pop-up, which is a lot cleaner, to a suggestion at the time of prescribing, which is shark-infested waters. So how do you balance those two? Becomes a question that you want to get into. We spoke a little bit about if it's the latter, some, depending on the specifics, may advise don't get into it. which I thought was an interesting comment. On the other hand, I think that we talked a little bit about the similarity between Google search results and sort of EHR search results. Is it similar? And then we talked a little bit about the patient engagement, and is that considered to be promotional or non-promotional? Can you have direct-to-patient scientific engagement, and what are the risks and benefits associated with that? Did I miss anything?
No, that sounds like it was a full conversation as always. A lot of
fun. Dale, where can they reach you?
PhillyCooke.com.
PhillyCooke.com. And on Twitter?
At PhillyCooke. I haven't been on Twitter as much lately, but absolutely. I check in every now and then. Send me a DM.
Perfect. And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. Feel free to share this podcast because we love to have people reach out to us. You can find me on Twitter, or you can find me on our website at darshantalks.com or on Twitter at darshantalks. Dale, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you, Darshan. Have a great day.
You too.